Lois Chatham, and I'm a Dare Extension Master Gardener Volunteer, and today's program is going to be on pollinators. We're going to take a look at the pollination process. We'll talk about why pollination is important. Who are our pollinators? We'll take a look at that. And what is happening to some of our pollinators. And then lastly, we will take a look at what you can do to help our pollinators. You know, plants can't move to find a mate, so they need help from the environment to exchange genetic material. Millions of years ago, plants developed flowers to attract insects and other animals to help them move the pollen from the male part of one flower to the female part of another flower. The pollinator picks up the pollen from one flower and delivers it to the stigma of another flower. Then it travels down the pollen tubes to the ovary and fertilizes it to begin that process of developing it into seeds. To grow good crops, we need pollinators. And to prove that, an experiment was conducted in which they took a raspberry plant and they covered part of that with mesh to prevent pollinators from reaching the flowers. All the other conditions were exactly the same. They had the same amount of water, it had the same amount of light, fertilizer, and everything else. And what they found was that the fruit on the part that was covered by mesh did not form properly. And you can see that here on this slide. They just don't look very appetizing. And the fruit that was on the uncovered part was very well formed. And so what they learned was that pollinators are very, very important for our plants. So even if the weather is perfect, without pollination, fruits will not form properly. And sometimes we think, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? You may not have done anything wrong if you don't have the right pollinators to help your plants with their fruits and vegetables. Now this picture was taken by Whole Foods, and it shows your produce choices with bees and your produce choices without. And you can see the top photo actually has a typical produce area in a grocery store with lots of different fruits and vegetables. And then the bottom slide picture shows that there really are not that many choices. A lot of our fruits and vegetables would be gone, such as apples, limes, avocados, just to name a few. So we care about our pollinators because they do pollinate our food crops. Over 150 crops in the United States are dependent on pollinators. Also, about 80% of all flowering plants need animal pollinators. The plants that need pollinators are important to our ecosystem. Now this slide actually shows you an ecosystem, and you see that the plants are at the bottom and they support all the living creatures above it. So if plants couldn't reproduce, it would affect all of these animals and the entire ecosystem. If I were to ask you to name a pollinator, the first one that more than likely comes to mind is the honeybee. Well, beekeeping has been around for over 9,000 years, but most people do not realize that there were no honeybees in America before European settlers brought the hives from Europe about 400 years ago. In the United States, we actually managed the western, also known as the European honeybee. Bees are the most efficient pollinators, and they are the only pollinators that purposely collects pollen because they need the pollen as a protein source from immature bees. Honeybees live in large colonies. They have distinct divisions of labor, and they produce and store lots of honey. Most of our food is pollinated by honeybees that is managed by commercial beekeepers. Now, these beekeepers manage thousands of hives and they move them around the country to place the bees near crops that are ready to be pollinated. Because each area of the country provides different products based on growing conditions, bees are really only needed for a short period of time. An example of that is in February. 30 billion bees are transported to California for the almond fields. Growers tell beekeepers how many hives they need and when they expect the crop to bloom. The beekeepers then load those hives up on their truck and bring it on the contracted date and place them near the crop. The bees start pollinating the flowering crop, and in the case of the almond crop, the bees are there for approximately 1 month. Then the beekeepers get the hives and put them back on the truck and transport them to another area of the country to pollinate another crop. And keep in mind that there was so many bees that have to be in California just for the almond fields that they probably would not all survive if they did not get transported other places. There just would not be enough food to support them. But we have lots of other pollinators beside the honeybee. There are 20,000 bee species worldwide. Honeybees are the most familiar, but native bees play a huge part in pollination. And there are 500 species of native bees here in North Carolina. Native bees have been pollinating the continent's flowering plants since long before the arrival of honeybees. They continue to do the majority share of pollination, especially when it comes to native plants. Native bees come in a wide array of sizes, shapes, and colors, as you can see by this slide. They are also varied in their lifestyles, the places that they frequent, the nests that they build, the flowers they visit, and also their season of activity. Now, bees have tongues, and they come in various lengths that helps them to determine which flowers they can obtain nectar and pollen from. Not all bees live in large colonies and make honey. Some native bees are solitary, like this mason bee. Bumblebees live under boards, abandoned nests, and other cavities. They forage at colder temperatures than honeybees. Now, the small carpenter bees like plants with pithy stems, such as roses or blackberry canes. The squash and gourd bees like sandy soil, and they may nest in your garden. The sweat bees like bare ground, compacted soil, not covered by vegetation. They forage for pollen early in the morning and then later for nectar. But we do have an amazing diversity of pollinators. There are about 200,000 different species of animals that act as pollinators in the world. The color of flowers bring different pollinators to your garden. Butterflies like bright flowers such as red or purple that have a wide landing pad. And the most famous of the pollinator wasps are the fig wasps. Specifically, they pollinate the many flowers which bloom inside the pear-shaped pod that eventually matures into the fruit. Now, these fig wasps are so important in the fertilization process that wild figs would most likely disappear without them. Now, bees like bright white, yellow, or blue flowers. Flies like pale and dull to dark brown or purple flowers that are shallow or funnel-like. Beetles like dull white or green flowers that are large bowl-like. Birds like scarlet, red, orange, or white flowers that have funnel-like cups. And bats like dull white, green, or purple flowers that may be closed during the day. Now, there are some primates that act as pollinators. In South Africa, the Cape gray mongoose pollinates the sugar bush plant, and the Cape rock sengi, which is in the elephant shrew family, pollinates the pagoda lily plant. And in Madagascar, the lemur, which is actually one of the world's largest pollinators, pollinates the traveler's palm. Now, reptiles can also act as pollinators. There are 40 species of lizards, and they are normally associated with island ecosystems. Now, plants and their pollinators have different roles. They can either be generalists or specialists. Now, specialist pollinators only visit one or a very few types of plants. Likewise, specialist plants are pollinated by only one or a very few pollinators, like this squash bee in the upper photo, which only pollinates bees in the squash family. Now, the generalist pollinators will visit many types of plants, and generalist plants are pollinated by many types of pollinators, like this bumblebee, who will pollinate many different types of plants. Now, a lot of people have wondered about honeybees and are they going extinct? But they really are not. But there are several factors that can affect these bees. There is the pests and pathogens, any poor nutrition, or pesticides. So the honeybees are not going extinct, but they do have a lot of challenges that make it tougher for the beekeepers to maintain healthy colonies. And the native bees, some of them are doing just fine, while others seem to be in severe decline. Native bees, like the rusty-patched bumblebee, have declined 87% in the last 20 years, and it is now on the endangered list. But there's a lot we don't know about native bee pollinator declines because they're not managed by beekeepers and live in large hives. So there are a couple of things that we can do, and we need to take a look at what really is causing some of these problems. It seems that most people are concerned about having a plush green lawn rather than having flowering plants. So we have lost millions of acres of flowering habitat from housing developments, lawns, cities, agriculture, and mown roadsides. As you can see from this picture, the nice green lawn. And actually, years ago, I remember traveling the highways and saw wildflowers all the time, and I rarely see that anymore. The entire diet of a bee comes from flowers. If there were no flowers, there would be no food for pollinators. We also move bees and plant products around the world and introduce diseases to new places. And our bees may not have natural defenses to fight off these new diseases. An example of that is the Varroa mite. Now, this is a parasite that was introduced to the European honeybee from the Asian honeybee. Varroa devastates European honeybee hives because they are not well suited to fight it. And Varroa has spread all over the world, and making it very tough to treat hives effectively for Varroa. We also use a lot of different pesticides. And we really don't know their effects oftentimes on the environment and pollinators. Pollinators can come in contact with many different types of chemicals. You see a lot of them listed here: herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, even diesel fuel. Pollinators can come in contact with chemicals in a lot of different places: on the flowers that they forage, in pollen that they bring home, in the water that they drink, and also in nests because of pesticide drift. Pesticides can have different effects on pollinators. It can have a lethal effect where it kills bees immediately upon contact, and we know that it has done something bad for our pollinators. Or it can have a sublethal effect, which could impair a bee's memory or foraging behavior. It can also affect their lifespan or the ability to reproduce. And these are the ones that we're really concerned with because of the fact that we don't see that happening immediately. Or it can have a neutral effect, which is little or no effect on bee health, and that's what we are hoping for. Stress factors can also have interacting effects. Pollinators can experience multiple stress factors at once. An example would be that pesticides make it more difficult for them to forage for food. And then combined factors make it more difficult to recover. So if it's difficult to forage for food, that means they have poor nutrition. And that then makes it difficult for bees to detoxify pesticides or fight off those infectious diseases. So what can we do to help our pollinators? Well, we can reduce exposure to pesticides, and we can plant native varieties of plants that are known to be more disease resistant. If you have chemicals, focus on ways to reduce exposures for pollinators. Some of the things that you can do, spray in the evening or when it's cool, because pollinators are more active during the heat of the day. Also, avoid using chemicals when flowers are blooming nearby, because what happens, especially in our area with the wind, it's going to carry that spray over onto plants that you had not intended to spray. You also want to use the minimum recommended dose. Read the label. Use the most specific chemical possible to treat the target pest. And also the label will tell you sometimes whether or not it is harmful to bees. And this is a bee advisory label that has a picture of a bee saying that, yes, this is very harmful to bees. But just because it does not have that label, don't assume that it is bee safe. You need to read the label, read the directions, and make sure it is the right product for the right pest that you are trying to eliminate. You also can plant flowers that bloom at different times of the year because pollinators need food all year long. You can plant native perennial varieties. Natives are actually better adapted to local conditions, which means that they require less care once they are established. You can plant with diversity. More diversity will support more pollinators and give them a more complete diet. You want to try to avoid a lot of hybrid varieties because they may be sterile or do not provide much pollen, so flowers will remain for a longer period of time. Most flowers will drop their petals once they've been pollinated and begin the task of producing seed. And that's why a lot of these hybrid varieties are out there. So you want to consider the rule of 3 when planting for pollinators. Plant that bloom in 3 seasons, have 3 different plants in bloom each season, and plant at least 3 or for each type of plant. So let's take a look at some of our plants that do well for pollinators. The bee balm is a very popular plant. It comes in red, white, purple flowers that bloom from May to September. And this plant attracts native bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. It does like moist soil in full sun to partial shade. It also is deer resistant, and that's something that we are all concerned about here on the Outer Banks, or at least most of us are. Black-eyed Susans have these yellow flowers that bloom June to October, and they are a pollen and nectar source for butterflies and native bees. They like well-drained soil in sun to partial shade, but these are only moderately deer resistant. Now the butterfly weed has orange flowers that bloom from late spring through the summer, and it is the host plant for the monarch butterfly. It is an adult nectar source and larva food source. In the late summer, you may see caterpillars crawling all over this plant, eating the leaves, but don't pick those caterpillars off. They're important for the monarch butterfly lifespan. You don't have to worry about them killing the plant because they only eat the leaves, and the leaves come back fairly quickly after that. Now, they are also a nectar source for honeybees. Keep in mind that all parts of this plant are poisonous if you eat it, so please don't eat the butterfly weed. It likes dry, well-drained soil in the full sun. Now, the purple coneflower, not only do they have purple flowers, but now they're coming in red or yellow, orange, and they bloom from May to August. And they are a nectar and pollen source for bees and butterflies during the summer. Now, coneflowers are drought tolerant, and they like well-drained soil in the full sun. If you're looking for a vine, you might want to consider the coral honeysuckle. It has red flowers that bloom from May to September, and it is a nectar source for hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. It likes average soil in full to partial sun, and this plant is also salt tolerant. Now, the ironweed has these deep purple flowers that bloom from midsummer to mid-fall. It is a nectar and pollen source for bees and butterflies. It also is a host plant to the American painted lady butterfly. It likes full sun and moist to wet soil, but it will tolerate drier soil, which actually makes this plant great if you are considering having a rain garden. Now, the Pye weed is not really a weed. It has flowers that range from white to pink to purple, and they bloom in July through September. Now, there is an abundant nectar for hummingbirds, butterflies, and bees, and they like wet, moist soil in the full sun. The Seashore Mallow blooms from July to October, and you can see this plant along Route 12 on Hatteras Island, and particularly at Pye Island National Wildlife Refuge. It has gray-green leaves with these pink flowers, and it is a pollen and nectar source for butterflies and hummingbirds. It also is a host plant for the American painted lady butterfly. Now, it likes moist to well-drained soil in sun to part shade. The Stokes aster has these deep violet or lavender blue flowers in July and August. Butterflies and bumblebees enjoy the nectar of this plant. It likes moist soil in sun to partial shade. As you can tell, most of the pollinator plants do like to have sun. Now, the swamp sunflower is also known as a narrow-leaf sunflower. And unlike most sunflowers, this is a native plant. It has yellow flowers that bloom September and October. So that makes it a great late-season nectar plant for bees and butterflies. Now, it does prefer moist soil in the full sun, and it is salt tolerant. It also is a host plant for the American painted lady butterfly. So we've talked about the diversity of pollinators. We've talked about why they are important for our ecosystem. And so with a combined effort, we can make the world a better place for our pollinators. Now, a handout may have been provided for you earlier. If not, you can request a handout from the library or from the Cooperative Extension. But this information is included on that handout. And the first reference guide, the pollinator.org guides, is an excellent booklet that talks about pollinators as well as a more complete list of plants that you might want to consider. When you go into this site, it's going to ask you for your zip code so that they can give you the information that is most appropriate for our area. So I want to thank you for attending this and learning more about the plants that do well here and also attract our pollinators.